Hello YouTube, I'm Tom, and today we're going to go full weathering on some sump boats, and wrestle with whether they are terrain or miniatures. I made these vessels in a previous video on cutting expanded PVC on the Cricut machine. I'll link to that video up top and in the description if you missed it. This video was meant to come out soon afterwards, but I took ages debating starting the painting. Do I give them a super basic paint job? Should they be mega detailed? Do I treat them like terrain or minis? And most importantly, just how filthy, grungy and rusty should they be? In the end, there was only one choice. Just fudging get on with it and see what happens. I decided I'd get everything base coated and use the smaller, less daunting boats as tests off camera. And, completely without thinking, I loaded up the airbrush with a nice white undercoat and began attempting to base coat white over a white miniature. Yes, that was about as easy and fun as you'd imagine. Anyway, eventually I was happy I'd got decent, or at least some sort of coverage, and I let that dry and moved on to a mix of various rusty browns for the base layer of rust. The base layer dried a little lighter and more patchy than I wanted, most likely in the areas I hadn't quite primed well enough. So I mixed up a thick wash with a deeper reddy orange and quickly smashed this all over each of the boats. These are the test boats. They used almost all the same steps I'm about to show you for the big boat, with only one small difference, but we'll get to that later. Importantly, they looked like you might need a tetanus jab from just looking at them, and I was happy with that, and feeling much better about tackling something bigger. The method I used relies heavily on sponging. For this, I used old blister pack foam, from the 90s I think, but it will work just fine with non-vintage foam. These sponges are made by taking a finger of foam and nibbling away a dabbing tip, like you see here. I used this Tamiya tape I inherited to mask the boundaries where two colours would meet. I believe it's specifically made to be gentle and not remove paint, but on my test ships I found it a little more sticky than I wanted, and I had a few very minor incidents. It could also be due to the age of the tape, but I couldn't say for sure. Either way, I'd recommend reducing the stickiness of the tape by first sticking it to either your top, unless it's some behemoth of a woolly jumper, or your skin, or even both if it's very sticky. The fibres on your clothes and the oils in your skin will both work well to mellow it out. A lot of the reference I looked at showed boats with an alternative colour on their bow, so I masked this strip on both sides before moving on to the stippling of the main colour of the body of the ship. This light desaturated green was mixed from a variety of old, inherited, slightly worn out greens and whites, and was inspired by a colour I've seen a chap called Corius use a lot on his terrain. He's a much better hobbyist than me, and I highly recommend you check out his work. I'll pop a link in the description. The stippling is simply a process of getting paint on your sponge and dabbing it away until it's coming off in little dots, as opposed to one big blob. It creates amazing natural variations on surfaces, and does a great job emulating chipping and worn paint. I will say it's important to rotate your foam a little as you dab away, or it's possible to create a kind of repeating pattern. Due to the depth of some of the areas, I needed to do a little hand painting as the sponge couldn't quite reach. Also, I wanted some more solid areas of colour to contrast the worn rusty ones. This was partially dabbed and partially normally painted, with a focus on not going too far into the crevices where rust likes to form. This was one of the processes I had toyed with the idea of. It's quite a lot of extra work, and if it were just a piece of scenery, it's probably one I would have skipped. But for something this big, I felt the extra effort was worth it. With that step done, I very cautiously removed the tape. I had some very minor paint peeling, but nothing that wouldn't simply add to the effect. Next, the deck was stippled, then hand painted in an off-white, before more tape was added to mask off the light green, for a sponging and hand painting of a rich turquoise blue over the bow. This time the masking tape came off without any drama, and I moved on to painting in the other areas. The majority of the signs, the barnacles, and one of the ropes got a coat of yellow sand. And then I added a few accents of bright red selectively about the rest of the boat. This choice was inspired by another amazing artist called Ian McHugh, whose work you should definitely check out too. Again, link in the description. I also added some freehand markings to add detail, as well as painting the harpoon, the roof and the crane with the same methods. With all the underrust, colours and detail down, it's looking a little too nice and clean, so let's move on to the top layers of weathering. We'll start by coming back in with a thicker version of our rust colour to add surface corrosion and paint chipping. The concept being that the whole hull is rusty, with the rust particularly gathering in the corners and crevices, but also peeling away the paint above and being chipped and worn away through impacts and time. So this pass breaks up some of the bigger patches of flat paint, distresses raised areas that take wear, and adds further texture. The key thing about this step is being restrained enough to leave areas clear and to keep the chipping as minimal as possible. Next up comes the oil recess shading, as she's looking a little flat at the moment. I did this using a raw umber and a dark brown called bitumen. This was one of the slight differences between the little boats and this one. On the smaller boats, I'd used a mixture of dark brown and a very dark blue-black called smoke. I found this was a little too dark, so swapped it out. Both colours were diluted with thinners to a fairly light wash consistency, then used alternatively, letting them mix naturally where they met. I hadn't tried this approach before and wanted to see if it worked, which I think it did. The varied shadow tints really elevate the grungy nature of the painting below and complement the size of the ship, much better than a flatter single shadow colour. She was looking really good, but needed that all-important layer of fresh rust. Here, I once again turned to oil paint, specifically ochre and light rust from Absalom 502. For this stage, I used less thinners and aimed for a heavy wash. As with the recess shading, I moved between the two colours as I went to add interest and variety. However, unlike the recess shading, I was selective about where I put the fresh rust. The goal was to lift the underlying rust, not simply obliterate it. Part of this process was adding dots of the rust colours to the flat panels. Once these have cured for around 30 minutes to an hour, these dots will be turned into streaks. Here she is before the streaking, with the dots mostly dry. Streaking the dots is simply a process of using a clean brush, dampened with thinners, and dragging it over the dots in the direction of gravity, or, in the case of the horizontal plates, dabbing the area to diffuse the edges of the rust dots. You need to use a careful balance of thinners and brushing to ensure you don't completely remove the dots. You also need to occasionally re-clean the brush, or you can end up with too much paint build-up on your brush. This process is definitely somewhere between an art and a science. Go steady, keep checking your brush, and don't get too careless. Once all the oils were thoroughly dry, I debated adding a varnish. On the one hand, the variety of paint types and finishes, some more matte and others more shiny, were really adding to an interesting surface finish. On the other hand, these boats might end up taking a bit of a beating, and I don't want all my work chipped or damaged. And in this case, I decided to go in more of the terrain direction, and protect as a priority, and hope the finish wouldn't be too diminished. I mixed a matte and gloss varnish, aiming for something not too glossy but with enough gloss content to create a good barrier against damage, and slapped it all over the boats and hoped for the best. Unfortunately, I wasn't completely happy with the varnish, but it wasn't a disaster either, and its more matte finish would nicely contrast my next step of painting the sump effluent. For this, I wanted a glossy, horrible, gunky, toxic green. I mixed a bright green with gloss varnish and some medium to thin it out. The idea was to build up depth and variety in the ooze, letting elements of the browns and colours below peek through the successive layers of glossy green to show the contaminants below the surface. In the end, this took 2 layers of the bright gloss mixture to get enough coverage, before I added a final layer of darker brown green as a more dilute gloss wash to shade the recesses of the waves and bring up the edge of the waterline. I also added some of this wash sparingly to the deck and the ladders. And then she was done. I'm really happy they finally got painted. I'll take imperfect but painted over unpainted and unfinished any day. Perhaps one day I'll try out chipping medium, but if, like me, it's not an ideal process for you, I think sponge stippling is a great alternative. In the end, I think they are more terrain than mini, and we wouldn't want them overshadowing the minis too much. What do you think? I'd love to hear in the comments. See you, YouTube!